Dolly Parton is one of the most influential artists in the history of American music, a living icon of the country pop genre who has shaped many generations. Throughout Dolly Parton's career, spanning more than half a century, she has sold over 100 million records worldwide, won numerous Grammy Awards, Country Music Association Awards, Academy of Country Music Awards, and been inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Songs like Jolene, 9 to 5, Coat of Many Colors, and especially I Will Always Love You have become timeless legacies, covered by hundreds of different artists, among which Whitney Houston's version elevated her name to global legendary status. Not only a singer, Dolly is also a songwriter with more than 3,000 self-composed songs, a rare number in the history of popular music. She also built an entertainment empire named Dollywood, turning it into one of the most successful theme parks in the United States, while being recognized as one of the most influential female entrepreneurs in the entertainment industry. In addition, she has received many honors, such as the Kennedy Center Honors and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, affirming her position not only in music, but also in American culture. But behind those dazzling lights is a truth few people see: a life always stretched between two worlds. When the stage is brightly lit, Dolly is the symbol of joy, of optimism, of dreamy America. But when the lights go out, she returns to a completely different life, where memories of poverty from Tennessee, family losses, and the feeling of loneliness from childhood still quietly exist. Dolly Parton had to learn to live like two people in the same body: a woman praised by the whole world, and an ordinary person carrying wounds that never disappear. That contrast has created her extraordinary willpower, forcing her to smile even when her heart is full of pressure, to sing happy songs while she herself sometimes has to fight silent sadness. That is the price of an icon, and also the reason why her life is not just a success story, but a journey of living between two worlds that never merge into one. Before moving on to the next part, please hit like and subscribe to the channel if Dolly Parton's story touches your heart. That is a small way to honor a life that has been lived between the glamour of the stage and the silent pains no one sees. Right after the brilliant halo and the honors that have made Dolly Parton one of the greatest icons of the United States, the story must go back to the starting point, where there are no lights, no stage, and no sign that a legend would be born. She was born in a small wooden house deep in the mountains of Tennessee, where winters were so cold that the wind could blow through every crack in the boards, and summers were so harsh it was as if the land itself was exhausted. It was not a proper house by modern world standards, but only a temporary shelter for a family trying to survive day by day. Dolly's family had 12 children, all crowded into a cramped space where every meal, every bed, every bit of warmth had to be shared to the minimum. There was nothing extra in that life, not even hope, because everything was limited by poverty that stretched on like an unchangeable destiny. Her father, a man who labored under harsh conditions, spent most of his life under the cold coal mines, where the air was so heavy that every breath was a battle. He returned home with a tired body and lungs gradually destroyed by coal dust, carrying a silence that even words could not soothe. Her mother, a strong but exhausted woman, had to struggle to raise a whole brood of children in conditions so deprived that every meal became a survival calculation. In that environment, Dolly Parton's childhood had no real sense of security, no space for innocent dreams, and no room for weakness. Every child in the family was forced to grow up faster than the real age, to learn to share, to learn to endure, and, most importantly, to learn not to ask too much from a life that was already too meager. Dolly grew up in the near-total absence of things that others consider normal: no financial stability, no guarantee for the future, and sometimes not even enough food for everyone in the family. But amid all that deprivation, there was one thing that still existed like a small flame that never went out, and that was music. In that simple wooden house, her mother's singing voice rang out as a natural part of life. the old Appalachian folk melodies, passed down like a spiritual legacy. And it was in those moments that Dolly began to feel something that rose above the harsh reality around her. The local church became one of the rare places that brought a sense of safety, where she could stand in the simple space and let her voice blend into the hymns, not to perform, but to survive. People later said that Dolly sang before she could walk, not as an exaggeration, but as a way to express a child born into poverty, but who found her voice through music. In that world, music was not a choice, but a refuge, the only place that asked nothing of her except to feel. But even in those seemingly peaceful moments, the awareness of deprivation was clearly present. Like a shadow that never left, Dolly Parton soon understood that life promised nothing, and if she wanted to survive, she had to find her own way to stand firm in a world not meant for children born into poverty. It was from those days that a strong survival instinct formed in her. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, like the very mountains where she was born. Each passing day was not a step toward the future, but a time of overcoming the present, where resilience was nurtured not by hope, but by the necessity to keep living. And in that harshness, the seed of something great began to form, quietly, silently, as the way legends are often born from places no one expects. After those years of childhood that already lacked stability, Dolly Parton's life moved into an even harsher phase, when loss was no longer a distant concept, but became an unavoidable reality that arrived too early, too suddenly, and left a void that could never be filled. Her father, the man who had spent most of his life in the dark coal mines of Tennessee, where every breath carried coal dust and fatigue accumulated over the years, was gradually consumed by black lung disease. It was not a quick or gentle departure, but a prolonged process of exhaustion, where his body slowly lost the ability to fight against the very environments that had sustained him. And for a child like Dolly, witnessing that process was not only seeing a father's weakening, but also the first time she realized that love, presence, and even family could disappear without any warning. When death finally came, it did not just cut off one life, but shattered the entire fragile spiritual structure of the family. The atmosphere in the small wooden house in Tennessee became heavier than ever, as if every laugh that had ever existed was drained away in a single moment. Her mother was forced to shoulder all the remaining responsibilities, serving as both the nurturer of the children and the only pillar left in a family teetering between poverty and loss. For the children, especially Dolly, the world suddenly became unsafe in any sense. When a father could vanish due to illness and labor, nothing guaranteed that tomorrow would not take away someone else. It was in that situation that growing up was no longer a natural process, but became a mandatory requirement. The children in the family had to learn to be quieter, to endure more, and, most importantly, not to be allowed to collapse, simply because there was no one left strong enough to lift them up. Dolly Parton was still very young at the time, but in her eyes there began to appear an awareness beyond her age, an early understanding of the fragility of life, where love and presence were never permanent. And it was from that moment that music began to take on a completely different meaning. It was no longer just melodies ringing in the church or in the small kitchen, but became a means for her to face the pain without having to name it. When she could not speak the loss, she sang. When she could not fully understand the emptiness, she let her voice lead the way. Music became the only place that allowed emotions to exist without being judged, without being stifled, and without being forgotten. In those simple hymn sessions between the old wooden walls and the dim light of the local church, Dolly began to learn how to turn sadness into sound, turn loss into something bearable, even if only for a moment. But deep inside, the wound of that departure never really closed. It quietly existed, like an inseparable part of her memory, shaping the way she viewed the world, the way she loved, and the way she faced things she could not control. From a child living in poverty, Dolly became a child who understood too well about loss, and that very thing planted in her a feeling that was both fragile and resilient, as if she were forced to learn to keep living while still carrying everything that had disappeared with time. And the memory of her father, of that too early departure, became an indelible part of Dolly Parton's soul, following her throughout the long life ahead like a silent shadow, never leaving but also never speaking. After learning to face loss from too early on, Dolly Parton's life did not become easier, but instead moved into a more subtle and prolonged type of challenge. Not material deprivation, not death, but existing in the shadow of another living legend within her own family. That person was Loretta Lynn, the older sister who had risen to become one of the greatest icons of American country music. A voice representing the working class, the women of Appalachia, and an entire generation. But for Dolly, that light was not only family pride, but also an invisible weight that began to cover every first step she took in music. From when she was still very young, wherever Dolly appeared, her name was not mentioned as a separate individual, but always came with an inescapable label: Loretta Lynn's little sister. That phrase, repeated in the press, on stage, in music industry conversations, gradually turned into an invisible cage where Dolly herself was reduced to a dependent image, rather than an independent artist seeking her own voice. In the world of Nashville music, where fame was built day by day through recognition, not being seen as a distinct individual meant having to start the battle to reclaim her identity from those who always thought they already understood her. Dolly Parton not only had to learn how to sing, write songs, and perform, but also had to learn how to exist in a space where every success of hers was placed next to a standard already shaped by someone else. Each new song was not evaluated as an independent work, but was always compared, analyzed, and weighed against Loretta Lynn's career, making any effort feel fragile and easily dismissed. In the early years of her career, this created a prolonged and tiring feeling, as Dolly always had to prove that she was not just a copy. It was not allowed to be different enough to break market expectations. That very tension made her artistic path a journey that moved forward while constantly being pulled back toward the oversized shadow of her older sister. In that environment, the space for Dolly to develop her personal identity barely existed. Everything from her voice, performance style, to song choices was scrutinized under an unrelenting lens of comparison, turning creativity into a process of both searching and self-denial. And when a person is not allowed to be fully themselves, what gets hurt first is not the career, but the sense of self-worth. In the rare, quiet moments between recording sessions and dense performance schedules, doubt began to appear in Dolly's mind, a question never spoken aloud but repeated endlessly: whether her talent truly existed, or if it was all just a faint reflection of a name that had already grown too large. That question, though unheard by anyone, became a form of prolonged mental pressure, making every step in her career carry a feeling of uncertainty, not only from the music industry, but even from the surrounding community. Dolly faced an implicit expectation that she must continue Loretta's legacy, that she must represent the same story, the same voice, and the same image already defined beforehand. In that circumstance, difference was not welcomed, but seen as a deviation. Because of that, the feeling of never being good enough gradually became a familiar part of Dolly Parton's inner life. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how well she sang or wrote music, there was always a gap between what she could do and what others expected. And in that gap, a special kind of loneliness began to form. Not loneliness from lacking people around, but loneliness because no one truly saw the real person behind the non-stop comparisons. It was a quiet loneliness, not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough to leave its mark on Dolly's entire journey of growth, turning every career step into a necessary yet painful affirmation of her having to find herself, even when the whole world seemed to have already decided who she was. After those years covered by the shadow of her legendary older sister, Dolly Parton's journey took her to Nashville, which was seen as the heart of American country music, but also a place that did not easily accept voices that did not follow the patterns already shaped beforehand. For Dolly, Nashville was not just a city, but the only door leading to the dream she had carried from her poor childhood, where music was not a choice, but a path of survival. Yet, when she stepped through that door, she was not welcomed as a promising artist, but as a voice that was too soft, too different, and not standard enough to fit the market at that time. In an industry that favored strength, clarity, and tradition, Dolly's gentle, soft, and emotionally rich style was seen as out of sync, something incomplete that needed adjustment. She was asked to change her voice, change her way of expression, even change the way she saw herself in order to fit better with what people believed the public wanted to hear. But it was within those demands that a silent conflict began to form between the real Dolly Parton and the image the industry wanted to create for her. Each time she entered the recording studio, each time she stood for auditions, Dolly faced not only technical evaluation, but also a pre-established system of standards, where difference was not considered a value, but a weakness that needed fixing. The initial failures came one after another, not loudly, but deep enough to shake the confidence she had tried to build since childhood. There were songs that were not chosen, recording sessions that were overlooked, and doubting glances that gradually made her clearly feel she was standing on the edge of the very industry she had poured her whole life into entering. The feeling of exclusion did not come directly, but seeped in like cold water, causing Dolly to begin questioning her own value, not only as an artist, but as a person trying to find her place in a world that was too big and too harsh. In Nashville, where every voice had to compete to be heard, silence was sometimes heavier than rejection, and that very silence made her feel as if she existed but was not truly recognized. The pressure to prove herself never stopped, because every small opportunity came with a great expectation that Dolly must change to become more correct, stronger, or more like what had succeeded before. But the more she was forced into the mold, the more clearly she felt that if she lost her true voice, she would also lose the very reason she started this journey in the first place. That tension made Nashville both an opportunity and a harsh challenge, where the dream was not broken immediately, but tested bit by bit through doubt, rejection, and prolonged pressure. In those days, Dolly Parton was not only fighting to be heard, but also fighting not to be turned into a strange version of herself, in an industry that always tried to redefine who she was before she could define herself. After those years full of pressure in Nashville, Dolly Parton's journey entered a more subtle but painful phase. It was no longer just rejection from the industry, but the loss of ownership over her own name and identity. The name Dolly Parton sounded like a complete icon, a clearly shaped brand, but few people knew that it did not fully belong to her from the beginning. It was formed, chosen, and attached to her in a context where Dolly herself did not have much control, like a label created to fit the market better rather than reflect the true person inside. For the public, that name gradually became a fixed image, a Southern American girl with a distinctive voice, striking blonde hair, and a smile that never turned off. But behind that name, the real Dolly Parton had to live in a hazy space, where the artist identity and the personal identity never truly merged into one. In the eyes of the media, she was not seen as an independent individual developing, but always framed in a simple and easy-to-understand label: Loretta Lynn's little sister. That phrase repeated through articles, introductions, and interviews, to the point where it was no longer information, but became a label that could not be removed. And that very label unintentionally obscured everything Dolly was trying to build for herself. No one truly saw her real self, a woman struggling between finding her own voice and the fear that that voice would never be recognized. In a world where everything was defined by comparison, Dolly gradually became a shadow even in her own existence. The name Dolly Parton became more famous the more the person behind it became more distant, as if she was standing watching her own life from a distance she could not reach. This separation did not happen in one moment, but accumulated day by day, with each public appearance, each article where her name was mentioned as an extension of someone else. And in the silence behind the lights, a quiet crisis began to form in Dolly Parton's mind. If everyone only saw a predefined version of her, then where was her real self? That question had no immediate answer, but it existed like a long crack in her perception, making every small success carry a feeling of strangeness, as if it belonged to someone else with the same name. When the artist identity had never truly belonged to herself, the feeling of disorientation became unavoidable. Dolly began to question the value of her own existence, not as a singer but as a human being, a person with the right to exist beyond the definitions others imposed. But in an industry where image was tightly controlled, where everything needed to be easy to understand and easy to sell, keeping her true self became a silent struggle. And it was within that tension that the name Dolly Parton became both a ticket that brought her success and a mask that obscured the real person she had never had the chance to fully show the world. After those years tied tightly to a name that did not fully belong to her, and an image always defined by others, Dolly Parton's journey entered a phase that on the outside seemed like the beginning of her career. But inside was a long series of days of silence and unseen struggle. When she signed her first contract with Decca Records, Dolly did not step into a world of free creativity as she had once imagined, but into a tight structure where every artistic decision had already been pre-shaped. It was not a place for voices seeking identity, but a place for producing music according to templates, where each artist had to fit an image calculated in advance. And in that system, Dolly was just a small piece, trying to survive among expectations that did not belong to her. From the very first days, she was asked to adjust her music style to fit the market better, to make her voice more standard, stronger, or more accessible according to the producer's criteria. But each time she tried to change like that, Dolly Parton felt as if she was moving further away from her true self, one more step. Her first songs were recorded under good technical conditions, released on schedule, but did not receive proportional recognition. They existed on the market like ordinary products, without creating buzz, without much attention, and gradually sank into the fierce competition of the music industry at that time. But for Dolly, it was not only a commercial failure, but also a deeper form of injury. The feeling that her voice, even though brought out to the world, was still not truly heard. In that working environment, creative freedom almost did not exist. Every song, every melody, every artistic choice had to go through censorship and direction from the company, making Dolly feel many times as if she was performing not for the audience, but for an invisible system deciding her own value. The feeling of being controlled did not come loudly, but seeped gradually through each recording session, each edit, each evaluating look from those who had the power to decide her future. And in that control, Dolly Parton's inner self began to accumulate a kind of fatigue hard to name. Not physical fatigue, but the exhaustion of a person continuously adjusting herself to fit standards she did not set. Each day passing in the studio was like an endless test, where the right answer was not truthfulness but fitting in. And when an artist could not be completely honest with her own voice, doubt began to appear like a small but spreading crack in her mind. Dolly began to wonder whether what she was creating truly had value, or if it was just an edited version of what others wanted to hear. That question had no clear answer, but it persisted, sneaking into every creative moment, making each musical note carry not only sound, but also doubt about the very person creating it. In the early years of her career, instead of the feeling of freedom that music should bring, Dolly experienced a quiet but heavy form of existence, where success had not yet appeared while fatigue had accumulated, and where the dream of becoming a singer came with the feeling of gradually losing control over her own voice. But it was precisely in that seemingly stifled phase that something important began to form in Dolly Parton's mind. A quiet but persistent will that if no one allowed her to become herself, then, one day, she would find her own way to do it, with her own strength, no matter how much silence and doubt she had to go through. During the long years of being suppressed within the framework of Decca Records, Dolly Parton's life entered a phase that seemed like a turning point to save her career, but in reality was another, more complex challenge, where artistic freedom only appeared in small parts amid new limits. When Dolly moved to United Artists Records, it was not just a change in contract or record label, but a hope that she would finally have the chance to be herself. In the early days, that feeling truly existed, like a soft ray of light piercing through the long chain of days under previous control. But that light did not last long, because immediately she was placed into a new collaboration structure with Porter Wagoner, a big star of country music at that time, who was both an opportunity, a pressure, a launching pad, and a limiting frame that Dolly had not anticipated. The artistic relationship between them was initially seen as a perfect combination, an experienced artist with great influence and a young voice full of potential seeking her place in the industry. But beneath that surface harmony was a silent conflict between two generations, two views on music, and two completely different perspectives on how an artist should exist in the entertainment world. Porter Wagoner represented an older era, where country music was built on clear templates, stable commerciality, and loyalty to a shaped image. Meanwhile, Dolly Parton carried an increasingly clear need to break free from all templates, to experiment, to fail, and most importantly, to become herself without having to ask permission. That difference at first was only small disagreements in the studio, song choices, arrangements, or ways of expressing emotion. But over time it gradually turned into a force, pulling in opposite directions, making the two no longer see music in the same way. While Porter wanted to maintain the familiar image that had brought success, Dolly felt trapped in that very success, as if every time she stepped on stage with him was one time she had to step back from her true self. The tension did not explode immediately, but accumulated slowly through each performance, each recording session, each edit in which Dolly's personal voice was blurred by commercial expectations. But it was in that repetition that an important realization began to form in her mind. If she continued on this path, she would forever be only a supporting part in someone else's story, no matter how successful she was on paper. And that was when the journey to seek true artistic independence really began. Not with a sudden decision, but with small but firm changes in the way Dolly viewed music and herself. She began to write more, experiment more, and most importantly, began to believe that her voice did not need to be adjusted to fit anyone. But that process was not easy at all, because every step toward freedom also meant one step further from the image that had once brought her relative stability in her career. In the relationship with Porter Wagoner, this created an increasingly clear distance, not only artistically, but also emotionally. The collaboration once seen as the foundation of success began to become a reflection of irreconcilable differences. And in that space, Dolly Parton gradually understood that breaking away from the old image was not just a career choice, but a survival requirement if she wanted to exist as a real artist. That realization marked the beginning of a quiet but powerful transformation process, where Dolly began to step out of the shadow not only of others, but also of the very expectations that had once defined her. Dolly Parton's life stepped into a fateful moment, where music was no longer just a career or ambition, but became the only means to express something that direct words could not describe: separation. The song, "I Will Always Love You," was not born from success, not written in the halo of fame, but was written in a room full of conflicting emotions. where Dolly stood at the boundary between gratitude and the need to leave in order to be herself. When she decided to leave Porter Wagoner, it was not an impulsive act, but the result of a long process of enduring creative suppression, where she gradually realized that professional attachment, even if it brought success, could also become an invisible cage that made a person lose their personal identity. But leaving had never been an easy decision, because behind it was not only a career, but also affection, attachment, and gratitude toward the person who had once opened the first big door for her. That very inner conflict created a special emotional state in Dolly, both relieved because she was finally free and pained because she had to say goodbye to an important part of her growth journey. And in that very state, the song was born as a message without confrontation, without resentment, but as a kind and tear-soaked farewell. Dolly Parton wrote each lyric as if she was talking to herself, that there were things one had to leave not because they no longer meant anything, but because a person needed to keep moving forward. I Will Always Love You, therefore, was not a love song in the usual sense, but a farewell wrapped in gentleness, where the pain did not explode, but quietly spread through every line. When the song was completed, it not only marked the end of an important professional relationship, but also opened a new chapter in Dolly's life, where she had to learn to stand alone in an industry that was used to seeing her as part of a duo rather than an independent artist. The departure brought her a clear feeling of liberation, as if a pressure that had lasted for years was finally lifted, but at the same time, it also left an unavoidable void, because not all freedom comes without the price of loss. It was in that moment that Dolly Parton understood that music was not only a place to express joy or success, but also the only place that could preserve the wounds that people could not carry with words. The song later, when performed by Whitney Houston, went beyond its original limits to become a global phenomenon, one of the greatest ballads of all time, bringing Dolly's private emotions to millions of people around the world. But even when reinterpreted in a new spotlight, its roots still lay in the very private moment of a woman who had to leave to find herself again. And that very thing made I Will Always Love You not only a musical success, but also proof that the truest pains often become the works that live longest in human memory. In Dolly's journey, music from then on was no longer simply a profession, but became the place where she stored everything that could not be said, where every melody carried a part of memory, a part of loss, and a part of the person she had been forced to leave behind in order to keep moving forward. After the moment when I Will Always Love You was born from the separation between freedom and loss, Dolly Parton's life entered a phase where the boundary between her true self and the public image began to blur no longer, but instead a deeper and deeper split emerged, as if she was living simultaneously in two completely different worlds. On stage, Dolly appeared as a symbol of light, of joy, of vitality that never turned off. The sparkling costumes, signature blonde hair, and wide smile made the audience feel as if they were seeing a person who was always happy, always full of energy, and never touched by the sorrows of life. But behind the scenes, in the silences no one saw, Dolly Parton's life was simple to the point of being almost completely opposite. There were no lights, no applause, no attention from millions of people, only a woman who chose quietness, privacy, and a rhythm of life separate from the noisy entertainment world. That very contrast gradually formed a clear separation between the public person and the real-life person, where two versions of the same individual began to operate like two parallel entities that never truly touched each other. The smile Dolly wore on stage, over time, was no longer just an expression of joy, but gradually became an emotional shield, a mechanism that helped her maintain the image the whole world had become familiar with, even when inside there were moments of fatigue, emptiness, or loneliness. Because in the industry where she existed, a positive image was not just a choice but an unofficial requirement, a constant expectation weighing on the shoulders of anyone who stepped into the public light. And for Dolly Parton, Maintaining that image gradually became an inseparable part of her music work. But the longer it went on, the clearer the difference between those two worlds became. One side was the brilliant stage, where everything was exaggerated, perfect, and always full of energy. The other side was everyday life, where everything slowed down, was quieter, and was much more deeply personal than what the public had ever known. This separation did not happen suddenly but formed over the years. Through each tour, each return home, each moment, Dolly stepped out of the lights and returned to herself. In that process, she began to clearly feel that she could not live as only one version, because each role demanded a different way of existing, a different way of behaving, and even a different way of feeling emotions. On stage, she had to be the symbol of optimism, but in real life, she was a person who needed peace to balance all the pressures she had gone through. That very contradiction created the feeling of living two parallel lives, not excluding each other, but also never merging into one. Dolly Parton gradually understood that the image the world saw was only a carefully selected part, a version refined to fit public expectations, while the rest of her existed in a completely different space, where there were no cameras, no audience, and no need to prove anything. But that very split also carried a silent pressure. How to keep both worlds steady without letting one collapse. When the stage lights grew brighter, the shadow behind grew longer, and Dolly began to feel more clearly than ever that her life was no longer a simple straight line, but two parallel flows continuously moving, both complementing each other and creating a gap that could not be filled. And in that gap, a quiet question appeared but never disappeared. Who was her real self when no one was looking? Dolly Parton's journey moved into a space completely different from the stage lights. It was the world of a love that needed no audience, no fame, and no public recognition at all. Amid all the glamour, dense schedules, and national icon image, Dolly still maintained a quiet, long-lasting relationship with Carl Dean, a man who lived almost completely outside the media spotlight. Their marriage was unlike any famous love story in the entertainment industry because it was not built on joint appearances, did not rely on public images, and did not need to prove to the world that it existed. From the beginning, both Dolly and Carl chose a very clear boundary. The public world and their own world would not blend into each other. That created a rare form of balance in Dolly Parton's life, where she could be a brilliant icon on stage, but still a normal woman when she returned to her private life. Carl Dean did not appear at award ceremonies, did not stand beside Dolly on the red carpet, and did not participate in the media activities that the industry usually expected from a star's partner. That very absence, instead of creating a negative void, became an important part that helped Dolly maintain mental stability for many decades. In a world where every relationship of celebrities could be scrutinized and turned into public stories, keeping this love away from the stage lights became a protective choice rather than hiding. One special point in Dolly Parton's life was that she had no biological children, something that for many people could be seen as a void, but in her journey carried a much more complex meaning. It was not a simple absence, but a life choice accompanied by other sacrifices, where Dolly devoted most of her energy to her career, to music, and to charitable activities that extended her influence to millions of other children. However, that also created a private space in her personal life, where family emotions were not expressed in the traditional way the public often expected. In the marriage with Carl Dean, respect for personal space became the most important foundation. They did not try to turn the relationship into a public story, nor did they try to convince the world that they were the ideal model, but simply maintained a parallel existence, one living in the light, one choosing the shadow, but both sharing a bond that needed no proof. That very separation helped Dolly Parton exist in the harsh entertainment industry without being completely dissolved into it, because she always had a place to return to, a space not defined by fame or public expectations. The love between Dolly and Carl was not expressed through noisy moments or glamorous images, but existed in very small, Very private things, things that never appeared in the press but played the role of a solid emotional foundation. Their family life, therefore, became a world completely separate from Dolly Parton's career, where fame had no right to intervene, and where peace was placed above all forms of external recognition. That very discretion created another form of double life, not between the stage and the inner self, but between the public and love, between the icon image and a private life that no one was allowed to touch. And in that separation, Dolly did not lose love, but kept it in the way she could exist the longest, without showing off, without proving, only needing to be present persistently and quietly beside her life partner, in a world that completely did not belong to the stage lights. After balancing between the stage and private life, Dolly Parton's journey entered a phase where success no longer meant liberation, but gradually became a new layer of pressure, more subtle and harder to recognize than any previous difficulty. When Dolly Parton's name extended beyond the United States to become an international icon, she was not only seen as a country singer, but as a cultural phenomenon, a representative of American optimism, and a model of success overcoming adversity. But even in that halo, a truth few people saw continued to exist. Fame had no ability to erase memories, and it certainly could not fade the traces of poverty that had sunk deep into Dolly Parton's childhood. Even while standing on the world's biggest stages, receiving the most prestigious awards, and being honored by millions of people, Dolly still carried within her the memories of a small wooden house in Tennessee, of days lacking food, of her father's too early loss, and of the feeling of always having to exist in conditions not safe enough to allow weakness. Those memories did not disappear with time, but quietly accompanied her like an inseparable part of her true self. Because of that, as success grew larger, the gap between the public image and Dolly's personal emotions became even clearer. The public saw an icon who always smiled, always positive, always bringing joy, but behind that was a person who had to continuously maintain the emotional state the whole world had become familiar with, even in the most tiring moments. The pressure to keep a positive image came not only from the entertainment industry, but also from the very expectations of the audience. Those who had linked Dolly Parton's name with absolute optimism, as if she had no right to be sad, no right to be exhausted, and no right to be a normal person. In periods of dense schedules, continuous touring, and non-stop public appearances, there were times when Dolly fell into a state of exhaustion, but could not show it outwardly, because that would mean shaking the image she had built over many decades. Those fatigues were not recorded on stage, did not appear in the lights, and did not become newspaper headlines, but only existed in rare private moments, when she separated herself from the world and faced her own silence. And it was in that silence that a special form of loneliness began to appear. Not loneliness from lacking people around, but loneliness because no one could see the real person behind the image that had become too familiar. The more she was loved, the more Dolly had to carry a fixed version of herself on her shoulders, and that made the boundary between her true self and the public person increasingly hard to distinguish. Success, instead of bringing freedom, gradually became an emotional burden where every step had to be considered not only artistically, but also in maintaining an icon that was not allowed to collapse. In the rare moments when the lights went out and there was no audience, Dolly Parton had to face a different reality. That the more brilliant her career was, the deeper the inner void sometimes became, because not every wound could be healed by recognition from the outside world. And it was in that paradox that Dolly's life moved into another layer of meaning, where success was no longer the destination, but became part of the journey of learning to live with both the light and the dark spaces that no one truly saw. After success had become an inseparable part of life, Dolly Parton's journey stepped into a more special phase, where she was no longer just a famous artist, but had become a cultural icon of America, an image representing optimism, joy, and the spirit of rising above adversity. But precisely when she became an icon, Dolly also began to face a type of pressure that very few people could see from the outside. The pressure of always having to represent something bigger than herself. The public did not just love her for her music, but also for the image of a person who was always positive, always smiling, always bringing the feeling that life, no matter how difficult, could be overcome with cheerfulness and resilience. But that unintentionally turned Dolly into an icon who was not allowed to be weak. In the eyes of the world, she was not just a singer, but a role model, a symbol of positivity. And precisely because of that, she had no right to show the dark sides, the fatigue, or the moments of instability that are natural to any human being. Every time she stepped out in public, Dolly Parton had to maintain an almost fixed emotional state, where her smile was not only an expression of joy, but also a symbolic requirement. Over time, constantly having to keep that image created a silent but continuous pressure, making the boundary between her real self and her public persona increasingly blurred. Dolly began to learn how to split herself into two parts, one part appearing before the public in the role of a flawless icon, and another part existing in her private life, where she was allowed to be imperfect, allowed to be silent, and allowed to just be an ordinary person. But even that separation was not entirely easy, because the outside world always tended to identify the two versions as one, making every personal action potentially interpreted as part of the larger persona. In that process, an emotional protection mechanism gradually formed in Dolly's self-deprecation, turning personal traits, appearance, or everyday stories into laughter was not only a communication style, but also a way to control how others perceived her, to redefine things that could be misinterpreted. But behind that humor was a more complex emotional layer, where Dolly had to constantly balance between pleasing the public and keeping her true self from completely dissolving into the persona. The pressure of maintaining perfection stretched over many years, not in the sense of technical or career perfection, but perfection in the way of existing before the public. Always positive, always strong, always bringing a sense of safety to others. This very expectation made Dolly Parton's life become a series of days where emotional stability was no longer a personal choice, but a responsibility tied to her fame. And in that process, the gap between the real person and the persona grew larger and larger, not because she lost herself, but because the world only saw a very specific part of her. Every smile, every appearance, every word became part of a larger symbol, causing her personal existence to gradually be obscured by the image the public had built. In the prolongation of that state, Dolly understood that becoming an icon was not only an honor, but also a form of emotional responsibility, with no ending point, where she not only lived for herself, but also lived for the expectations of millions of people looking at her as a source of inspiration. And precisely in that double existence, she had to continue moving forward, between the light of the icon and the very human darkness that not everyone could see. After many decades living in the spotlight of fame and the pressure of becoming an icon, Dolly Parton's life entered a phase no longer defined by success or career, but by continuous losses that never truly close. As time passed, the family members she had grown up with, shared a poor childhood in Tennessee with, began to leave her life one by one. Each departure was not just a single event, but like a repeating rhythm of the same pain, only different in faces and timing. For Dolly, loss was no longer a surprise, but became a familiar part that she could never fully accept. It did not come and go, but stayed, silently accumulating, forming a heavy layer of memories weighing on her entire life journey. Among those losses, the passing of Loretta Lynn carried a special weight, not only because she was a major icon of country music, but also because she was part of Dolly's beginning story, someone who was both a role model, a shadow, and a spiritual support throughout a long time. When Loretta Lynn passed away, the feeling in Dolly was not just ordinary sadness, but the collapse of a connection that had existed from very early in her life, an invisible thread tying together memories, family, and music. The void left by that departure could not be filled by any achievements, whether awards, stages, or public recognition. It existed like a prolonged absence, silent but unavoidable, making every recollection become a confrontation with what could not be changed. In this phase, Dolly Parton began to gradually withdraw from public activities, not in a sudden or dramatic way, but like a slow process where her appearances became less frequent, her tours fewer, and the moments on stage no longer carried the same emotional rhythm as before. Music, which had once been the center of every movement in her life, gradually changed its meaning. It was no longer a path to conquer or affirm herself, but became a place to preserve memories, where each melody was like a piece of what had been lost, of the people who had left, and of a time that could not return. When Dolly sang, people no longer just heard an artist performing, but heard a person dialoguing with the past, with memories that had seeped into every breath of hers. Dolly Parton's life in this phase became quieter, not because she disappeared from the world, but because the way she existed in the world had changed. The noise of fame no longer occupied all living space. Instead, there were longer, deeper silences where thoughts and memories had time to echo more clearly. In those moments, the presence of the past became stronger than the present, as if time no longer ran forward linearly but circled around things that had once happened but had never truly disappeared. And precisely in that state, Dolly began to live a life no longer dominated by public expectations or iconic pressure, but by the necessity to reconcile with the losses that had become an inseparable part of herself. Music, once again, did not disappear but changed its form. From a career to a living memory, from a stage to a place for reminiscence, and from a means to rise to a way to hold on to what could no longer be held. After all the losses that kept echoing through each phase of life, Dolly Parton's story comes to an ending, not like a closure, but like a synthesis of three people coexisting in one single form: a poor child who grew up among the hills of Tennessee, a woman carrying wounds that were never fully healed, and an artist who had become one of the greatest cultural icons of America. Those three layers were not separate, but intertwined throughout her life, creating a complex yet consistent being, where every success carried traces of loss, and every smile contained a long history of silent endurance. What was special in Dolly's journey was not in the scandals or the collapses commonly seen in the entertainment world, but precisely in their absence. Her life was not noisy in a negative way, but full of wounds that never became newspaper headlines, were never told completely, and never disappeared entirely. Those pains existed in silence, in family memories, in the years of poor childhood, in the shadow of Loretta Lynn, in the invisible pressures of the music industry, and in the loneliness that fame could not erase. But what made Dolly's life different was not that she had no suffering, but the way she transformed those sufferings into a form of unshowy yet enduring strength. Instead of letting adversity define her, she turned it into material for her career, for her music, and for a cultural legacy that went beyond the boundaries of an ordinary country artist. Every song, every melody, every story she created carried the imprint of a person who had been through poverty, loss, and pressure, but still chose to stand firm with gentleness rather than bitterness. That was exactly what created the image of an icon not only of music, but also of the will to live, where softness did not mean weakness, and optimism was not a denial of pain, but a way to continue existing alongside it. When looking back at the entire journey, the concept of double life in Dolly Parton's life was no longer just the separation between stage and private life, but became a deeper structure of her being, between the persona and the true self, between memories and the present, between the brilliance of the public and the quietness of the inner world. It was not two opposing lives, but multiple layers of existence stacked upon each other, operating together in one single person, creating a complexity that only time could clarify. And that very complexity was what made Dolly a special icon in American culture. A woman not defined by one moment, one success, or one failure, but by the entire long process of surviving, adapting, and continuing to create light while still carrying her own darkness. When standing at the end of this journey, Dolly's image was no longer just a singer, a songwriter, or a businesswoman, but had become a living icon of America, where her story reflected a very real part of the American dream. That success does not erase the past, but people can still move forward even though that past has never left. And in that final gaze, Dolly Parton is not remembered only for what she has achieved, but for the way she has lived through all of it. With quiet resilience, with unshowy kindness, and with a smile that has existed long enough to protect an entire lifetime, but has never lost the truest part inside it. Looking back at Dolly Parton's entire journey, people do not just see a music icon of America, but also see a life made up of opposing emotional layers. Poverty in Tennessee, losing her father from when she was very young, growing up in a cramped wooden house with a large family, and stepping into Nashville with empty hands but carrying a voice that would never be silenced. The most heartbreaking thing is not that she went through poverty or pressure, but that she had to learn how to smile while those wounds continued to exist silently inside her. Throughout the story, the image of two parallel lives is not just an artistic concept, but the living reality of a person. A Dolly who shines brightly on stage, and a Dolly who is lonely in the silences behind the lights, where there is no audience and no recognition. Details like being called Loretta Lynn's little sister, having to struggle to escape Loretta Lynn's shadow, or writing, "I will always love you" as a tearful goodbye to Porter Wagoner, all show that her success never came without trading for deep emotional wounds. Even her discreet marriage to Carl Dean reflects a choice to live separately between the public spotlight and private peace, as a way to keep the real person from being swallowed by fame. The biggest lesson from Dolly Parton's life for the American people does not lie in titles or awards, but in the ability to turn adversity into strength without losing kindness. In a society where people are often under pressure to always succeed, always be positive, and always be perfect, her story reminds us that behind every smile there can be a long journey of endurance and silence. But it is precisely the fact that she continues to sing, continues to create, and continues to love, even after going through so much loss, that makes her legacy eternal. Dolly Parton is not only proof of the American dream, but also a reminder that true strength does not lie in never falling, but in still standing up with a heart that has not become hardened by what life has brought. If the story of Dolly Parton's life, full of resilience and silent pains, has touched your heart, please hit subscribe and leave a small mark to continue accompanying stories full of emotion like this one. Thank you for listening, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue exploring the lives behind the spotlight that the world has never seen.